Hello and welcome to my channel Polyglot Reading. My name is David and today I would like to present you some of the reading highlights of my reading month of April. I discovered the author Hans Fallada just a few months ago, and in my review of my 2023 highlights I already presented the novel Little Men What Now. And this year in April I read his novel Once a Jailbird. I read it on my Kindle, so I can't show you the original cover here. Hans Fallada is, I would say, a typical author of the so-called New Objectivity that was a literary movement in the 1920s and 30s that describes the life of the so-called little people in the 1920s and 30s. And quite simple but still impressive language. And in terms of content, the literature of the New Objectivity is oriented less towards lofty or abstract ideals, but more towards everyday challenges, social and economic problems, poverty and social tensions. And it's also the case in this novel. In Once a Jailbird, we follow the convict Willy Kufald, who is released from prison after 5 years, and who is now trying to regain a decent place in the German society in the Weimar Republic. And he tries to make a living with an honest job. He no longer wants to become a convict. He's really fed up with prison life. But one obstacle after the other is put in his way by a society that is full of prejudice against former convicts, or even by hypocritical rascals who try to prey on former convicts. And it starts right away with the hostel for former prisoners to which he is released because he no longer has a family or a flat. And here he falls into the clutches of a perfidious charity system that is run by really greedy hypocrites. And this is disguised on the outside as a pious work of Christian charity, but at its core it is designed to keep former prisoners dependent, to exploit them commercially, and to prevent their return to a new honest life, just out of the greed for profit. Willy Kufald, he is quite resourceful and he manages to escape the system, and he tries to build a new love relationship with a partner, and he tries to set up his own typing pool or a writing office in order to earn an honest living. But he cannot shake off the stigma of a jailbird, and society will not let him out of the role of a former convict. So that in his desperation, he ultimately sees no other option than to become a petty crook again, and in order to survive. And so this novel is a bitterly angry reckoning with social prejudice and the sham morality of supposedly decent but basically bigoted and selfish citizens who prey on the weakest members of society. It's a gripping portrayal of a personal fate, which the reader can follow with great empathy, despite the sometimes a bit distanced and matter-of-factly style of writing. But Fallada is probably also able to describe so authentically the everyday prison life and the life after prison, and the small and large-scale harassment both in prison and after release, because he himself spent some time in prison. The book really impressed me, and it will not be the last one I read by Hans Fallada. Let's move on to English literature. In English, I read the novel Lady Anna by Anthony Trollope. I read this one in English, this nice edition, illustrated edition by the English Folio Society. If you want to buy it new, they are quite costly, but in the antiquarian book market, they're quite cheap. I think this was 10 or 15 euros, including the postage delivery fee, so quite economic. I think I mentioned earlier that Trollope is really one of my favorite Victorian writers, even ahead of Dickens in my personal ranking. And Lady Anna was rather objected or rejected by his contemporaries because it was perceived as scandalous, but Trollope himself considered it to be his best novel. And as is often the case with Trollope, the driving force in this novel is a scandal or a problem rooted in the complex British inheritance law. But don't worry, it's not at all dry and legalistic. The novel first introduces the backstory of the main character of Lady Anna. It tells the story of her mother, Josephine, who had entered into a marriage with Earl Lovell, or Lovell, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, who had entered into a marriage with Earl Lovell against all advice, less out of love, but rather than because she was attracted by his wealth and by the social status. And this Earl Lovell was a real scoundrel. He was known for ruining young women, and this was also the fate of Anna's mother, Josephine. After the wedding, the Earl told her that the marriage was invalid. For him, it was just a joke because he was already married to an Italian woman in Sicily, and so he left Josephine and Anna, who is now considered an illegitimate child. He left them in poverty and exposed to social contempt. And Josephine and Anna were only saved from ruin by Josephine's friend, the widowed tailor Thwaite, who not only took her and her daughter in and fed them, but also sacrificed all his financial resources to support Josephine in her legal dispute, that is, to fight in her fight to be recognized as the legitimate wife and to fight for the associated title of nobility and, of course, her share of the estate or the fortune. But being in the right does not mean that you will be granted your right by the legal system. And so the process drags on for decades without any result. When the Earl finally dies and a distant nephew of his, a so-called Frederick Lavelle, also lays claim to the inheritance, the legal dispute picks up speed again, and even the lawyers on both sides are racking their brains over the legal implications and situation. And the simple solution that they come up with is that for both sides, it would be best if Josephine's daughter and the aforementioned Frederick were to marry. Then there would be no need to discuss the difficult question of inheritance law, and the fortune and the title would definitely be in the right hands, and also Joanna would then be rehabilitated. And Frederick is also quite taken with the likable and pretty Anna and would agree to this arrangement. There's just one smaller complication. Anna does not agree. She is in love with Daniel Thwaite, that is the son of the tailor Thwaite, who has supported her mother and Anna over the decades. And Daniel is also in love with Anna, and so the two are determined to get married. And the whole castle in the air, that are the lawyers on both sides, Frederick and Josephine, have devised, comes down, it crashes. And however, Anna's mother, Josephine, is not prepared to accept this under any circumstance. Her burning desire to become economically and socially rehabilitated has become her only goal in life. Now, together with the lawyers from both parties, she sets in motion a whole machinery of intrigue and persuasion and brute force in order to separate Anna from Daniel Thwaite and marry her off to Frederick Lavelle. And she is literally prepared to kill in order to achieve her lifelong dream and to gain satisfaction for all the injustice that she herself has experienced all these decades long. And in my opinion, Trollope describes in a very credible and gripping way how Joanna's obsession grows stronger and stronger, and the hatred with which she fights everything that stands in her way. I won't tell you whether the novel has a good or bad ending, but I can promise you that it is thoroughly exciting and an enjoyable read. As well as being a credible psychological study, the novel is also a fiery indictment of the injustices of the Victorian society and the unequal opportunities for rich and poor to get their right in that legal system, and above all, how rightless and dependent, in particular, women were in this male-dominated society. They were just the property and the pawns of the machination of men, and particularly of wealthy and influential men. Another Victorian novel that I read in April, but I read it in a German translation because I stumbled across this nice edition. It was the novel The Ordeal of Richard Feverel by George Meredith. It was published in 1859, and I think it is often written that the novel sets new standards for the Victorian literature in its description of the psychology of its main characters and in its criticism of the prudish and repressive Victorian attitude towards sexuality. And critics such as Martin Tucker, Donald Stone, and John Priestley even regard this as the first modern novel in English literature. I don't know whether this is the case, but let's just take a look at the key points of the novel's topic and of its plot. As the subtitle of the novel reveals, it's also the story of a very problematic father-son relationship. And at its core, it's also a scathing criticism of an educational attitude that I would describe as pedagogical optimism. It is the idea that you can mold a child or a growing adolescent according to your own wishes and goals if you just only use the right system and apply it as consistently as possible. And even strong and partly instinct-driven behaviors and things such as love and sexual desire can be controlled as desired through educational measures. In other words, an illusionary pedagogical concept that is fortunately alien to us today, at least I hope so, because we essentially see the purpose of upbringing and education as being to create the necessary conditions for the child's inherent potential and inclinations to develop as well as possible. But in the Victorian area, the pedagogical concept that Meredith attacks in this novel were probably widespread, and so this critique was really necessary. The plot goes as follows. Sir Austin Feverel has been jilted by his wife, who has run off with a young poet. And so Sir Justin now is solely responsible for the upbringing of their son, Richard. And he doesn't think much of the school system. So he's seeing too many dangers of harmful influence on his son. So he decides to bring up and educate his son himself. And so Feverel considers himself a decently scientifically educated person, and he's therefore convinced of his scientifically based system for raising Richard. And so he implements the system with sometimes inhuman consistency. An important goal is to keep Richard away from the female sex as long as possible, to prevent any erotic experiences at all, and above all, to avoid a love affair or a marriage that is not in keeping with his status. And despite all his father's supervision and care, Richard falls in love with Lucy Desborough, the penniless niece of a neighboring farmer. A catastrophe for the father. And now his father pulls all the stops to separate the two. And there's a series of actions. A courtesan deliberately paid and set on Richard to seduce him. A duel a squad of quirky and bizarre male relatives, mostly uncles of Richard, who interfere in Richard's education with varying motives and varying degrees of success. And I don't want to reveal how this conflict ends, so as not to spoil the book for you, I will only say this much, that the novel succeeds very convincingly in dismantling the nonsense, the inhumanity, and also the destructive power of Richard's father's authoritarian educational scientific system, and how this system keeps Richard in a state of emotional immaturity. The description of love affairs, which is quite frank by Victorian standards, was shocking for the contemporaries, but to be honest, by today's standards, the novel is absolutely suitable for the nursery. The psychological interplay between Richard and Lucy and Sir Austen is described in great detail, but not overloaded, which I appreciate very much. And the serious and sometimes dramatic nature of the father-son conflict is also lightened up a little by Meredith through the interventions of Richard's quirky uncles, who each have very distinctive character flaws, and this adds a little spice of humor now and then, and this helps to alleviate this tough subject a little bit. It is a book highly recommended for lovers of Victorian literature, and I think Meredith is one of the many excellent Victorian writers who are unfortunately very little known, at least in Germany, because here they are eclipsed, I would say, by Charles Dickens, by the Bronte sisters, and some earlier 19th century writers like Jane Austen, who dominate the English literature segment in the German book market, at least with regard to 19th century authors. Okay, moving on to another language. The next book is a classic of the Scandinavian literature, but I read it in German translation in this beautiful leather-bound German edition of 1912. It's the two-part novel Jerusalem by the Swedish author Selma Lagerlöf. Selma Lagerlöf was certainly one of the most important Swedish authors at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And in 1909, she was actually the first woman who ever received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I think because of the great success of her novel Niels Holgersson, she is, in my opinion, wrongly reduced mainly to this work and mainly perceived as an author of children's books. And nothing could be more wrong. The majority of her literary work is by no means written for children or young people. And in my opinion, it's absolutely worth rediscovering this author. Jerusalem is, I would say, an episodic novel, consists of a number of episodes about a village community in a small town in Sweden that is seized by a religious revival movement. And as a consequence of this religious revival movement, a large part of this village community decides to emigrate to Jerusalem in pious enthusiasm to join there a small evangelical community founded by a North American traveling preacher. And the tensions created by this religious movement within the village community and also with the local pastor and the difficulties of gaining a foothold in the new home at Jerusalem, the rejection, the suspicions, and also slander by other religious groups in the Holy Land are described in a very comprehensible and also thoroughly exciting way. And this is interwoven with the description of a number of individual fates of a couple of main characters of the novels, of their personal conflicts, of their longings, their family tensions that arise from the fact that a part of the family is part of the religious movement, another part is not, or love stories who are separated by this immigration. envy and jealousy. And Lagerlöf also beautifully shows how natural human weaknesses and selfish motives are at work beneath the surface, despite all the idealism and religious fervor, which is, however, described as authentic rather than hypocritical, but still we can't escape human nature. And this book, I think, is a treasure for anyone who is interested in the dynamics of religious movements. I think especially the evangelical and pietist movements of the 19th century, which brought about significant social challenges in many regions of Europe, in particular in the Protestant country. And some of these changes are still perceptible today. And Lagerlöf manages well the balancing act between an empathetic portrayal of idealism and the many commendable deeds on the one hand and acts of charity, but also the human weaknesses that are evident in even the most pious movements. And what also makes the novel interesting is that the plot is partly based on a true and a real historic event. There really was such a small Swedish village community that made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem out of religious enthusiasm, thus forming the model for Lagerlöf's novel. And the novel also provides interesting insights, historical insights into village social structures in a period of upheaval at the end of the 19th century, when modernity and modern ideas also reached rural areas and conventional traditions started to crumble, and previous authorities such as the state and the official church lost respect and influence. And I find one other aspect worth mentioning, the piety movement that is described here in no way corresponds to Selma Lagerlöf's own religious creeds and convictions, but she refrains from any kind of judgment, devaluation, satire, or mockery. She observes and describes the dynamic that such movements can develop, and she does so with great empathy for those involved. However, she does not report as a purely objective, very distant, dry chronicler with an external view, but rather as a very analytical observer who really tries to trace the inner lives and motivations of the protagonists, and through her description also allows the reader to draw conclusions about the psychological processes in the main characters and in what is the social mechanisms that are at work in these two communities that are at the center here, the village community in Sweden on the one hand and the Jerusalem community of the awakened ones on the other hand. An interesting novel by an author wrongly reduced to the children's story Nils Holgersson, really worth to be rediscovered. Last but not least, an excursion to Italian literature. In Italian, I read the novel La Mennulara by Simonetta Agnello-Hornby, and the English translation was published under the title The Almond Picker. Simonetta Agnello-Hornby was born in Sicily, but she has lived in London since the 1970s, I think, and where she worked as a lawyer, but by now she has also published a whole series of novels in, let's say, the category of middlebrow entertainment literature. Many of these books have made the bestseller lists in Italy and been translated in more than 20 languages. And such a category as middlebrow entertainment literature or middlebrow light fiction is of course always an imperfect tool. But what I want to say is this: it is solidly written. It is well written. It has an interesting plot, but it's definitely not Nobel Prize winning literature. But even the more spoiled reader can read it with pleasure and interest and feel well and cleverly entertained afterwards. And this is a lot for a book. And it's not just a case of reeling off cliches or narrative standard recipes. La Mennulara, the Almond Picker, was Simonetta Agnello-Hornby's debut novel in 2002, and it won three literary prizes the year it was published in Italy. And the story begins when we learn of the death of a woman called Maria Rosalia Inzerillo, mainly known as the Mennulara, the almond picker. And this woman, for decades, she was a sort of domestic servant or maid for the wealthy land-owning Alphalipes family. But as an unusually strong-willed woman with a strong character, she has earned herself a certain position and reputation in the local community, but not viewed without suspicion. And everyone in the village has their own opinion and perspective, and with some rumors and some gossip to contribute. And from these different perspectives, Agnello-Hornby slowly pieces together a multifaceted but sometimes also contradictory picture of this woman. And in particular, the last years of her life are shrouded in rumor, when she was mostly the sole companion of the last two heads of the Alphalipes family. And yeah, people are questioning, could it be that this simple and uneducated woman was actually an equal dialogue partner for the cultivated old gentleman? And could it be true that he actually helped him to curate and to finalize his collection of valuable ceramics with a wealth of knowledge of her own? Or did she embezzle the most valuable pieces to keep them from the heirs, and to make her own nephew benefit from the wealth? And also, the legitimate heirs of the Alphalipes are presented to us with great, sometimes caustic humor. Their bigoted hypocrisy. Hypocrisy? How do you pronounce it? I don't know. Hypocrisy. Their seemingly bourgeois existences that are based on small and big lies, their vices and character flaws lurking behind the cultivated facade. And it's an entertaining novel with a dash of detective story and plenty of Sicilian local color, but without appearing provincial. The cover and the title of the English edition could give the impression that this is a pure love story in the style of Rosamund Pilcher, but this impression is misleading. Simonetta Agnello-Hornby novels have nothing in common with that type of literature. It's a good novel for the terrace or for the hammock on a spring afternoon or a summer weekend, but one for what that you don't have to leave your brain at the cloakroom to enjoy reading the novel. That's it for today. That were my highlights, the highlights from my reading month of April. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you know some of the books or the authors, if you've read these very books or something else by the authors, if you have a different opinion on the books presented, please let me know in the comments. I would love to enter into a discussion with you. Yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Take care. Hope to see you next time. Bye bye and ciao.